And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. With the current global situation, we tend to talk about the global order, where Sri Lanka stands amid geopolitical rivalry, and especially what Sri Lanka's economy is going to make out of the current situation. I've invited to our studios to discuss all this and much more a former permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the UN, a former Foreign Affairs Secretary of Sri Lanka, and a former ambassador of Sri Lanka to China, none other than Dr. Palitha Kohona. A very warm welcome to you.
I'm happy to be here again.
Certainly, we're indeed honored to have you again. You've been an ambassador, you were permanent representative to the UN, as I mentioned, a former Foreign Affairs Secretary. With all this, you were also formerly a permanent employee of the Foreign Affairs Ministry or Foreign Service of Australia. With all this, what was more challenging to you?
I think everyone had its own challenges. I was very young when I was recruited to the Australian Foreign Service, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as it is called. And I am very happy that I started my career there because it was a challenging time. Australia was rapidly becoming a multicultural society and was quietly shedding the historical approaches it had towards everything. And also Australia was focusing on Asia very much at that time. So it was a very challenging time to work for the Australian Foreign Service. And I must say that the training that I had in the Australian Foreign Service had stood me in good stead over the years.
You were chief negotiator for treaties at the UN as well. So which of these roles were more challenging, per se? I'm sure you have sat at negotiating tables. You were also participated in peace talks with the LTTE in Geneva and led the delegation in Oslo back then.
I spent 10 years at the United Nations as the head of the treaty section, the UN treaty section. That was not a negotiating position because you were in charge of the treaties, mainly deposited with the United Nations. 55,000 plus bilateral treaties and close to 1,000 multilateral treaties. And I was actually involved in the negotiation of some of those treaties in the late 90s and early 2000s. For example, I was very much involved in the negotiation of the Montreal Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, and other treaties, and of course the SDGs. So they were like critical challenges as I occupied a position at the United Nations.
Was it easy for you to move out of the Australian Foreign Service and join the Sri Lankan Foreign Service? Was it a difficult decision? How did that come by?
No, I was by that time, by the time I came back to Sri Lanka, I was a full-time employee of the United Nations. I had resigned from the Australian Foreign Service because I found the job at the United Nations much to my liking, and it was an extremely challenging job. As you may know, I made some considerable changes in the office that I controlled, and for which Kofi Annan gave me a special award. So it was to the challenge that I was dealing with that kept me at the United Nations. I resigned from the Australian Foreign Service because I wanted to stay on at the United Nations. Then in 2006, on the invitation of the newly elected president at the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa, I returned to Sri Lanka. First, to assist with the negotiations that were going on with the LTTE to try and resolve the problem with the LTTE in an amicable manner through negotiations. Of course, it didn't work out. The LTTE challenge was resolved militarily.
What can you share with us about those negotiations? Post-war, there have been discussions whether Sri Lanka should have entered war, or Sri Lanka could have maybe solved the national issue in a more amicable manner through dialogue. But what led to the breakdown of these negotiations?
As a person who was involved in the negotiations, in February 2006, in May 2006 and October 2006, after a while I was convinced that the LTTE was not interested in a negotiated end to the conflict, because on all those occasions it was the LTTE that walked out of the negotiations or simply did not come to the negotiations, while the government team stayed at the table. So it was, and then of course the government actually, I believe at the time, was very much committed to ending the conflict in a way that was satisfactory to both sides, both parties, in an amicable way and a way that satisfied the needs of both parties. But I personally don't think that the LTTE was ever interested in a negotiated end or a peaceful end to the conflict.
Does this mean there was no dialogue between the two parties, or was Sri Lanka able to offer anything to the LTTE?
Well, of course, a negotiation is not about offering. It's about finding a middle ground. A negotiation is not one party enforcing its views on the other party. You need to come to a satisfactory win-win solution somewhere in the middle. I believe at the time the government was committed to doing that, but the LTTE did not reciprocate. And as I must repeat that my belief at the time, and this is a person who had come out of the United Nations with all the idealism that one could muster or one could acquire, and I believed in that at the beginning. I thought that it would be possible to bring the conflict to an end if both parties could agree on something that was satisfactory from both sides. So of course, sometimes you have to give in, sometimes you have to make concessions, but ultimately I was convinced that the conflict, the LTTE was not interested in an amicable settlement. It wanted its own way.
You were head of treaty section of the United Nations, and you had modernized the way many UN, let's say, work was done, and as you mentioned earlier, then UN Secretary General had personally recognized you too. But at the same time, we're talking about negotiations and decision making in today's world situation. But what do you think about the UN's role today and its decision making?
You have to remember that the United Nations is not an entity out there in the stratosphere. It's a club of nations. Every country is a legitimate member of this club. There are 193 members. So whatever the United Nations does is a reflection of what the members wish. And of course, there are some members who are more equal than others, especially the permanent five in the Security Council. So what the United Nations does, it doesn't make decisions of its own, independent of the factors that influence it. The United Nations it works reflecting the wishes of member states. And then, of course, there are times when the Security Council gets involved, and the Security Council reflects, hopefully, the wishes of 15 members, but more likely the wishes of the permanent five. Because as you know, a permanent member can veto a decision on the Security Council. Most recently, we have had resolutions involving Israel being vetoed by the United States. So this happens. So in order for the United Nations to be effective politically, I take the view that you also must have the commitment of the permanent five, and then of course in a wider sense the Security Council. The United Nations at the end of the day is a club, a limited club of member states, and it's not an independent entity somewhere out there in the ether making decisions for humanity with no accountability. it is accountable to its member states, and it reflects the views of the member states. And in many areas, it has done so quite successfully.
Dr. Kohona, now critics argue that the UN has failed to prevent major wars of the 21st century, from Syria to Ukraine to Gaza. But are these also due to structural issues, or is it due to lack of political will of these major countries? And also, do you think the UN serves the purpose it was really the reason why it was formed back in 1945, or has it become largely symbolic? And what does this mean to small countries like Sri Lanka, who depend on justice of larger global organizations?
So let's talk about basics here. The UN was formed primarily to ensure that there would not be a war of the scale of the Second World War. The UN was a result of what happened, the scourge of war that destroyed a major part of Europe during that time, during that war. And of course, one could argue that it has successfully prevented the major powers from going to war with each other. In this, it has succeeded. I don't know whether it was because of the UN or because of the major powers themselves being reluctant to expose themselves to a war with the other major power. But having said that, there are sparks around the world where regional conflicts happen on a regular basis. Even as we speak, there are conflicts in the Ukraine, in Gaza, in certain African countries. So these are things that the UN has been abysmally deficient in preventing or resolving. Something more needs to be done to ensure that the UN can be effective in situations like that. And there have been many suggestions, many proposals for this purpose. But again, a factor that comes into play is the role being played by the permanent five members of the Security Council. Where they agree, they can resolve the problem. We have a good example of Cambodia, where a conflict that lasted 10 years was resolved because the permanent five agreed on what to do there. So we have situations like that. But on the other hand, there are things that the UN has done which could not have been achieved if not for the UN. The health benefits that the entire world enjoys at the moment were achieved largely through a UN agency, the World Health Organization. The educational advances, child health advances, these were managed largely through UN agencies. So in that respect, the UN has served a tremendous purpose, and it can continue to serve that purpose. Now, for example, we are continuously talking about global warming and climate change. The entire initiative came out of the United Nations in the early 90s, 1992 in fact. And today we work as a global community to address some of the problems that have resulted from global warming and climate change. The rules of the sea, the law of the sea, is essentially an outcome of the work done by the United Nations. So we shouldn't be too damning about the achievements of the United Nations. The UN has achieved certain things and which have benefited humanity by and large, and in certain areas, key areas, it has not succeeded. But not because, in my view, the UN as an agency has failed, but because its member states, particularly the key member states, have failed.
So is reform really possible at this stage when everyone says the UN is frozen by the veto power of these 5 member states?
I don't think anything is impossible. Everything is possible. It's just that we have to try. We have to try, we have to fail, and we have to try again. And we fail again, we try again. We keep on trying. Our goal is to create a better world.
With Trump tariffs and the superpowers trying their luck with other countries, whether it's their influence in smaller states or strategic locations. And recently, the H-1B visa of the United States, a most sought-after visa they brought in new regulations, and China followed with the introduction of a new visa category aimed at attracting foreign professionals in science and technology. With all this happening, we see Trump tariffs, the wars. So what do the role of trade pacts and treaties, what does that mean here?
So we have had a major agreement, the GATT, from late 1940s onwards, put in place to manage international trade. And it was countries like the US which championed liberalized trade, and some refer to as free trade. There never has been free trade, it's been liberalized trade. And they championed it. They put pressure on smaller countries to open up their markets so that trade could flow without restrictions that they used to. In fact, one of the reasons for establishing the GATT in the 1940s was the feeling that the World War resulted because of the imbalances in trade. So a managed framework for world trade was considered to be important to ensure continuing peace. And we went on, we struggled from one negotiation to another. Eventually we ended up with the World Trade Organization in 1994. And we thought, at last we've got an agency which would ensure the smooth evolution of international trade to a point where global trade would be more or less liberalized. Unfortunately, all that is being turned back now because we have the United States imposing tariffs on almost everything imaginable. Some countries are being punitively dealt with through the tariffs, other countries to a lesser extent. But that entire regime based on continuous liberalization appears to have come to a standstill, which is unfortunate. So we have a new scenario, a new global framework. We need to deal with it, which means that every country needs to deal with each other on a bilateral basis. This is what we, when we created the GATT in the 1940s, and then eventually the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, the goal was to avoid the bilateral trade framework and create a global framework. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get there in a hurry.
But if the UN was moving away or trying to get countries to move away from protectionist policies, and the US, as you said, championed opening up of economies and connectivity, world trade connectivity, and now the US itself resorting to more protectionist policies and American-only policies, how do you think this is going to help countries like Sri Lanka, who are more dependent on trade now more than ever? The US is Sri Lanka's single largest trading partner, and China a major partner, but there are sensitivities also. We'll get to the geopolitical scenario later, but in terms of trade, Dr. Kohona, how do you think countries like Sri Lanka will survive in this new scenario that we're talking about?
I need to separate the United Nations from global trade. The UN was intended to be the political nerve center of the world, while trade negotiations did not happen at the United Nations. The trade negotiations happened in Geneva in the context of the GATT and the WTO. So the two have always been parallel but related tracks. And in Geneva, the emphasis had always been on liberalizing trade further. Every step was towards more liberalization. But now we have come to a standstill because of this sudden shift in the US attitude. And then, of course, all countries which trade with the United States, countries like Sri Lanka, India, even China, have been forced onto a different track, which is unfortunate because it is believed, and many economists believe, that countries benefited from the liberalization of trade. Small countries like Japan, Korea, boom because of it. China is a classic example of a country that did tremendously well out of the World Trade Organization. Then other countries have benefited too. But it is unfortunate that we have now to go back to a previous era where we have to deal with each other on a bilateral basis.
Do you think this is also paving the way for a shift in power dynamics?
I think it would, because the United States still is the major global economic power, while it is also the major global military power. Yeah. So the US is in a position to impose its views on other countries. As to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, only history will tell. Because we have examples from the past where countries have tried to do that and things have not ended up well for anyone. So let's hope that good sense will prevail and multilateralism will come back to the fore.
You were former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs between 2006 and 2009. Sri Lanka's foreign relations, or Sri Lanka's the manner in which Sri Lanka really balances the influence of superpowers, global powers, continues to be criticized or questioned. Do you think Sri Lanka is managing influences properly?
I think we have to be very careful when we get into that area, because Sri Lanka has a very big neighbor, an influential neighbor, India. We also have another neighbor, China, which is now the second biggest economic power in the world, with limitless cash reserves, and it also a military power. We have the traditional power, which is the United States, which has dominated the world for over a century. We have the Europeans, which still think they dominate the world. I don't think they do, but they're there for what it's worth. So Sri Lanka, during the conflict with the LTTE, managed to balance all these powers in a way that at the end of it, we came out on top. Because on the one hand, you had India, which had an interest in what was going on in Sri Lanka. India did not want to have a Sri Lanka that was difficult to manage. And then we had a good relationship with India. We also kept China on board, so that we had endless assistance from China to deal with the situation we were confronting at the time. We also had to deal with Western countries which were coming under pressure from the diaspora, which was largely sympathetic to the LTTE. And there were times when weapons shipments were suspended, where Sri Lanka was constantly coming under pressure to suspend our military operations, etc. We had to manage them. And this was, I believe that at the time we did it very effectively. The pressures, we managed them, and we also, not only that, we benefited from some of the countries like the United States. The United States helped us considerably despite the domestic pressures that it was coming under. India was a major factor, I think, in Sri Lanka being able to overcome the terrorist threat. And then, of course, China was unstinting in its support of Sri Lanka. So that was a difficult time. And when somebody writes a history of that period, they will agree or conclude that despite the difficulties, we managed those challenges quite effectively. And at the end of the day, we did emerge on top.
If one says Sri Lanka has failed to really effectively manage these powers and their influence in Sri Lanka, or even to balance the level of influence they have equally, how could that be possible if Sri Lanka managed such a difficult time with the influence of foreign powers, or even a strong diaspora in the West?
See, the facts speak for themselves. Sri Lanka defeated the LTTE despite all these factors that it had to deal with. And then on top of it, we also managed our economy quite successfully at the time. So the two of them go hand in hand. What happened subsequently is a different matter, and I think that also, I mean, people will have their own views on what happened subsequently, but during the time that we dealt with LTTE, the Sri Lanka's efforts to deal with the different influences were quite successful. You know that Europe banned the LTTE, proscribed the LTTE as a unit. So it's not an easy task to achieve, but it was achieved. And it was largely the efforts of the diplomats working in those capitals that's resulted in this. We also had the US, if not on side, at least not against us. Even to this day, the LTTE remains banned in those countries, proscribed in those countries. India, which could have played a different role, did not. It ensured, it was India's role that ensured that the LTTE was defeated eventually. Yeah. And then, of course, we had the solid backing of China on the other side, and countries like Japan, which were very sympathetic to Sri Lanka. So people tend to forget that this balancing act was not accidental. It didn't happen because we were purely lucky.
Was there a lot of pressure from these countries?
Of course, you know, there was a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of pressure at some points to end our military campaign. And it was, I would say, was almost daily pressure to do that. And in some cases, like Europe, stopped supplying us with replacement parts for our weaponry. And this, I mean, I could go into details, perhaps at a different occasion. But
did India pressurize Sri Lanka?
India did not. Well, I don't think I should go into the details. Mm-hmm. India understood what Sri Lanka was doing, and India, I believe, also appreciated the fact that if Sri Lanka's success would end up being to India's advantage.
You earlier mentioned that India didn't want to have a Sri Lanka that's too difficult to manage. Do you think Sri Lanka is that country that is not too difficult to manage for India?
What I meant was, if Sri Lanka is integrated into a state that was splintered or challenged permanently by terrorism, I think that would have been very difficult for India, because we are only 22 miles from the Indian shore, and whatever happens here, given the historical links, the ethnic links, could have overflowed into India.
China's support during the time of the conflict, did China take too much of advantage of that support to Sri Lanka? Because China's level of involvement through the Belt and Road Initiative, its economic drive, many argue that China was taking advantage and pushing Sri Lanka into a debt trap. You were ambassador of Sri Lanka to China.
I think it's unfair and unethical to suggest that China pushed us into any situation. When Sri Lanka wanted weapons, we went to China. China did not come to us with weapons. When we wanted financial assistance, we went to China and sought financial assistance. And at no point, in my understanding, has China said that we want this advantage from you or that advantage from you. It has always been a relationship between equals, and China has been very ethical about the way it dealt with Sri Lanka. I was there for 3 years, and to me, it was a very rewarding experience, because China never really exerted pressure on us to do anything that was contrary to our own wishes. On the other hand, China, we are the ones who, over and over again, requested certain assistance from China, whether it was the support for us in Geneva at the Human Rights Council or support for us in New York. We were the ones who sought that assistance. China did not overload us with offers. And then when we wanted to build Hambantota, and this is where this whole question of the debt trap came up, you'll recall that the feasibility studies for Hambantota were done first by a Canadian company under Canadian aid, and secondly by a Danish company. Both of them recommended the construction of the harbour because it's only 20 kilometers from one of the busiest seaways in the world, sea lanes in the world. 36,000 ships go up and down along that sea lane annually. And Sri Lanka would have benefited from that traffic. These two companies, which we consulted, recommended the construction. Then we went to the World Bank for financial assistance. We were knocked back. We went to other countries in the West and not so far in the West for assistance. All of them were not interested. It was only then that we went to China. So China did not come to us with assistance to build Hambantota, but we went to China. And then, of course, the loan was on not even on commercial terms. It was on preferential terms. So this whole thing about the debt trap.
Do you think China saw the strategic advantage of being involved in Hambantota? And to follow up on that, why do you think Hambantota, if the feasibility study assured that it would have been one of a very lucrative seaport for Sri Lanka, why it hasn't really stood to its potential today?
I think anything, when anything you construct with that amount of investment, personally I think it takes time to come to fruition. It will take time. I mean, the moment you build a harbour, it doesn't mean that everyone is going to alter their long-term plans and come to that harbour. They will come. And I read an article in The Economist not too long ago which suggested that Hambantota had, this is the Economist published in England, that Hambantota had the potential to becoming the key port in South Asia, not only in Sri Lanka, in South Asia. We know that Colombo is the biggest transit port in the region at the moment. Now with Hambantota coming on stream, it's before long, I'm sure it will take over a similar role.
To go back to the LTTE diaspora and conflict, today one may argue that the separatist ideology has resurfaced. We saw genocide monument in Canada and diaspora gaining momentum at whether it's UNHRC or the campaigning that is done. So is this, Dr. Kohona, in your opinion, a failure of Sri Lanka's diplomatic missions, or is it a failure of Sri Lanka's management of the allies, the Western allies of the country?
Different people will take different views on this, but I think we shouldn't drop the ball. We should continue to work on this issue, because you see that in other conflicts around the world, minority groups, especially located in the West, have continued to push their cause. So I would expect the sympathizers of the LTTE to do the same. But what is important is that we need, as a government and as a people, we need to maintain our own stance in a logical, convincing manner. Maybe we need to put more effort into that.
The UNHRC sessions and ongoing accountability measures taken by the Western world at UNHRC sessions continues to be a question, and certain military personnel targeted. That is another criticism Sri Lanka faces, that Sri Lanka has not faced this effectively, have secured to, or at least tried to secure the military personnel from facing such damage internationally. What did you do differently back in the day through the Foreign Service? Was there more training for the diplomatic staff, the Foreign Service, or was the messaging different, or did all Foreign Service personnel representing Sri Lanka have one common goal?
I think I'll just talk something in general. Diplomacy is not only about being very clever about what you do or just smart about what you do. It's a whole range of things. You need to interact with people, especially your interlocutors and your critics. You need to be with them constantly. It's a hard job. And there's no stopping at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. Diplomacy is a 24-hour job. You need to be available to deal with people as and when issues arise. And you need to be familiar with the issues from your national perspective, most importantly. And so I think we need to work really hard at it to ensure that our national interest is relayed effectively to the world community, especially to our critics. I'm sure as we did during the war, we could get our message across in an effective manner so that our military personnel will not be subjected to the same constraints that they are being constrained now. That as a country, we are not being subjected to measures that others are not subjected to. I mean, there's a conflict going on in the Middle East. We don't find the same strictures being used or the same vitriol being poured on that situation the way that it is being poured on Sri Lanka. So it's difficult to say what is right and what is wrong that we need to do at this point, but we need to work hard at it, continue to work hard at it, so that we don't drop the ball. Because at the end of the day, it's the national interest that needs to be advanced. And the national interest includes the possibility of sanctions and other constraints being imposed by interested parties at the international level. And it's already being done in the case of our military personnel. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of work done in an intelligent manner so that the country and its military personnel are protected in the long run.
You mentioned diplomacy is not a 24-hour or 8-to-5 job, but a 24-hour service. You have represented the Australian Foreign Service, then the UN, and Sri Lanka as well. But how would you really address any challenges that the Sri Lankan Foreign Service has, especially when we talk about diplomats working to safeguard Sri Lanka's image or to promote Sri Lanka internationally, or whether it's to strike new deals, agreements with other countries? As you network, is there enough budgeting? These are all questions that many ask. So how would you really see those challenges, especially because you've worked outside as well?
I think the Sri Lankan Foreign Service has enormous potential. It has had great people in the past, and we need to ensure that the recruits and even those in the system are continuously trained not only in what is important to the country, also in what can be done to ensure that what is important to our country is realized. And this means a lot of training, a lot of commitment on the part of the staff, and that can be achieved only through providing them with adequate incentives. Today, I know staff tend to treat this as another job, but to me, diplomacy is not just another job. There's a lot more to diplomacy than simply treating it as another job. And then, of course, we do look after our diplomats reasonably well. We look after their children. We look after them when they are on overseas postings. And there should be more also for the amount of work that we are supposed to do, the range of issues that we are dealing with. I think we need to have more staffing. And the staffing has to be allocated in a strategic manner. For example, China, which is one of our major trading partners. When I was the ambassador there, I had only 3 or 4 Sri Lankan diplomatic staff working for me, which is absolutely inadequate, because there are countries like Pakistan. Pakistan had 23 diplomatic officers based in
China?
In China. We had just 2 or 3, if I remember right. And that's totally inadequate. China is our either the biggest or second biggest trading partner. Politically, it is absolutely important to us. And culturally, and in many other aspects, it is a very important country. That's only as an example. There are other places, similar places. And diplomacy is not only about being clever in the office, but you also need to hang out with people, interact, because the personal relationship matters a lot in diplomacy. I mean, I think in New York, one of the reasons that we really did not have too much political problems for a long time is because of the relationships that we developed during that period.
So that they're just one phone call away. We'll take a short break here at Hyde Park on Other Derana. We're in conversation with Dr. Palitha Kohona, Sri Lanka's former permanent representative to the United Nations, former permanent secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka, and former ambassador to China. We'll be right back after this short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. We're in conversation with former Sri Lankan diplomat Dr. Palitha Kohona. We've been talking about India, China, the world global order amid ongoing wars. But I'd like to focus more on Sri Lanka now, with Sri Lanka's debt obligations, whether it's debt restructuring, and the question of China, whether we are going to really put some of Sri Lanka's strategic assets and sovereignty at risk when it comes to debt restructuring. And China's sizable share of debt in Sri Lanka, this has continued to be questioned. And India, a major partner in Sri Lanka's revival from crisis. And many questioned whether Sri Lanka worked well with India or worked enough with India, whether Sri Lanka did not look to India for support earlier. How do you feel about this?
I think Sri Lanka dealt with an unfamiliar situation when it had to declare bankruptcy. And of course, we had to turn around. We dealt with IMF, and that was important. And I must say that China, I was in China at the time, and they encouraged us to go to the IMF. They supported us going to the IMF. Not only that, China is a critical member of the IMF. China's support was vital when we were talking to the IMF. So I think in that respect, China helped us a great deal, because it was very clear, and I know that in my conversations in Beijing, they made it very clear that they will support Sri Lanka's approach to the IMF, and not only support the approach, will speak out on our behalf. So as you know, we successfully negotiated the restructuring exercise with the IMF. IMF also extended the necessary funding for Sri Lanka, albeit spread over 3 or 4 years. But our credit rating has since then has improved, which is a good sign. And the IMF itself and the World Bank have said that Sri Lanka's recovery is almost unprecedented. So we've done well from that. I think the government has done a great job in ensuring that the economies remain stable. So this, all this, I think Sri Lanka should get the credit for doing all this. We shouldn't look outside and say so-and-so was the critical force behind this, or so-and-so was not the critical force. These countries helped. India helped us a great deal, no doubt about that. China also assisted us in no mean measure. But at the end of the day, it was Sri Lanka itself deciding to pull itself up by its bootstraps, and it worked. Maybe there's a lot more that we can do, And I'm sure there are economists who are working on these things even as we speak. But there are things like, for example, in my own view, we need to do more about improving our export performance. And perhaps it is time to consider the free trade agreement with China again, the revision of the free trade agreement with India again, so that Sri Lanka can do better in its exports. And these are things that we need to be working on.
How do you think Sri Lanka can better leverage our diaspora to attract more investments, trade, especially with foreign exchange being a problem area that Sri Lanka must address in the long run?
India did it successfully. The diaspora helped the inflow of talent and investments to India. We may need to adopt a similar approach to encourage our citizens, or the Sri Lankan diaspora living in the West, to think more about investing here. And I know some of them are doing it already. I know some of these people personally. It is happening, but their work needs to be emphasized and publicized so others will take advantage. And then incentives need to be provided. What would a Sri Lankan living in the United States gain by investing in Sri Lanka? There must be tangible incentives, in my view. And perhaps it's time to have a conference in Colombo where we invite the diaspora to come in and share their views on what could be done to increase investments. What India did was phenomenal, because India attracts billions of dollars worth of inward investments, and some of it is coming from the diaspora. So we could do the same thing. And there are rich Sri Lankans, successful Sri Lankans, and there are lots of unsuccessful Sri Lankans also living in the West. But we could work on this, and I mean, I may not have the answers to pull out of my hat, but if we get together, maybe have a conference of Sri Lankans overseas, invite them here, offer them incentives, and see what we can do.
Is it possible for us to bring the diaspora community together? Because we have a large Tamil diaspora, we have a Sinhalese diaspora, we also have within the country still remnants of certain cultural or communal differences that can be stirred up against one another. So how do you think Sri Lanka can really address this?
I think we shouldn't talk about these differences and emphasize them. In fact, we should emphasize the similarities and the commonalities rather than the differences. It is a very small country where we have lived together for thousands of years, and there is a view, and a convincing view, that these differences have come to the fore only in the last century or less, because there is political advantage in stirring up these differences. Why don't we talk about the commonalities and the similarities rather than the differences? Personally, I think that would be the better way to go.
Where do you think Sri Lanka will be? I mean, post-war Sri Lanka, there were a lot of dreams among young people about where Sri Lanka would be by 2025. We didn't see an economic crisis coming, but of course, as you mentioned before, there's much potential for Sri Lanka. You talk about working on our assets, on bringing our similarities together, bringing the diaspora to Sri Lanka, but where can we go from here amid these challenges, but also taking Sri Lanka's advantages as leverage?
I think we need to have a vision as a country, because we have an extremely talented population, an educated population, which we have not used so far. We have encouraged our educated people to leave the country rather than stay here and do something for the country. Because by and large, the incentives that we should be providing have not been provided. Then let's provide a vision, a dream, so that our people will stay and develop this country, provide the necessary incentives, the necessary tax breaks. So it's a joint exercise that should be undertaken by the government, civil society, and the people themselves, because at the end of the day, this is a beautiful country, and it has been recognized as such by numerous travel journals in the last year or so. It is an easy country to come to, but this ease of establishing here has not been marketed adequately. The fact that we have a highly educated population, the best educated population in South Asia, and what we do is educate our children and encourage them to go somewhere else. Instead, let us give them a dream, give them a vision, so that they will stay here and make this country a better place, not only for themselves, but for future generations.
You were born in beautiful Matale, and you moved to Australia but returned to Sri Lanka. You're a legal practitioner too, if I'm not mistaken. LLB, LLM, and a PhD? In
International Economic Law.
It was indeed a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Kohona.
It's always a pleasure talking to you. It's a great opportunity.
Indeed.
Thank
you. We were honored to have Dr. Palitha Kohona, former ambassador of Sri Lanka to China, former permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations, former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka. We'll be back next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park. Have a pleasant evening and enjoy the rest of the lineup of programs. Good night.